No, no.
Ladies and gentlemen, hi, my name is Dr. Shavindra. No, come on.
You're a smart guy.
Kuna.
You are impressive guy.
Good afternoon, everyone. May I ask participants to come sitting in the center, please, so that you can see the screen very well. May I request participants to sit in the center, please? Or you want to sit from that one? Thank you. To come sitting in the center.
So the technical sessions. We have a full session today. This is a session essentially derived varieties, a perspective from the building sector, from the seed sector. So what I do is to invite Dr. Arvind Kapil, who is chairman of APSA Biodiversity Committee for his opening remarks, and then take us to the session, followed by the panel, and then we close the session. Thank you so much. Yes.
Very good afternoon to you. I hope you have good lunch and must have a good session to hear now. The session is regarding essential derived varieties of the perspective. As one of that has now, not only and develop orders, but also have a cross lines with the IP. So this discussion, when we started this discussion about ADVs, as you know that the plant is now happening and we are using a lot of technologies in plant breeding. The technologies includes the gene editing technologies. Based on that, we have and I with APSA and ISF, we were discussing the this one of exchange happened. Different opinions came on that discussion, and which you will hear from our panelists. that how we reach to a kind of consensus now that we have to visit the explanatory notes in the UPOM so that everybody knows that when you are using protected tissue variety, what you have to look for and how you are using it. So we will know some legal perspective, and we will also discuss the issue around it, and we also see how the opinion is coming from the breeders. But we have five presentation. Three are from your office, and he's a director of computer affairs. He's a Swedish and has a law degree, so he will explain about the disability use. Then Dr. Koala, she's regulatory affairs manager of ISF, and she has 51 experience in the field of agriculture innovations. And I see she was part of the discussion of UPOM. And we know that for last 1 year, we have gone many times about this discussions. I think she will take us through that. And then we have Chris. So Chris is had a role in different plant variety protection office for last 30 years, and is currently the manager of plant variety rights office. And he will also explain about this issue in the internet. And then we have Mr. Park from Court. Is also explaining the position of the private sector. Then Dr. Hani, who is a guest examiner in the Center of Science and Technology in Mara, and he is a biologist, and he will explain also about this. So in all, I think I will consider the different presentation. After that, we have the panel discussion, which is led by Francois. And in the panel discussion, Francois will put different questions to the candidates, and they will solve the things. So without further, so now I will invite Martin for the first presentation. And he's online. I think they will present. Martin, you are online?
Yes, hello. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I hear you not so good, but if you can hear me, I can start the presentation. So, hello everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this part of the APSA meeting, where you will discuss essentially derived varieties. It would have been a great pleasure to be with you in New Zealand, but unfortunately it was not possible this time. So I have been asked to make a presentation on the situation on the EDV from a UPA perspective, and I will try to do that in the coming 20 or so minutes. So perhaps if you could change the slide, please. So I will say just a couple of words on the purpose of and concept of the EDVs, and a little bit about the protection of EDVs, and then I will focus on the UPOV guidelines that has been recently adopted by the Council of the UPOV. So next slide, please. So the purpose of this, I think that has been also discussed in the seminar that was held in 2019, is to ensure sustainable plant breeding developments by providing effective protection for the breeder and encouraging cooperation between breeders and developers of new technologies, such as genetic modification. So next slide, please. So a little bit about the protection of EDVs. I think that most of you are aware of the subject, and some of you are very experienced and specialized in this, but I will say a couple of words of the protection of the EDVs before going into the guidance. So please, next slide, please. Well, you have in the UPOC Convention, Article 14.5, that the provisions of paragraphs 1 to 4 of this Article 14 on the scope protection shall also apply to varieties that are essentially derived from the protected variety, where the protected variety is not itself an essentially derived variety. And the scope of protection that is mentioned in 1 to 4 is essentially to commercialize the variety, but we can go to the next slide to look closer to that. So next slide, please. So what you see here is a list of activities that requires the authorization of the holder of the right, and that would also include essential varieties, so the production or reproduction, so the multiplication in essence, the conditioning for the purpose of propagation, offering for sale, selling or marketing, exporting or importing, and stocking for one of those purposes. And that is for any protected variety. So it could be a variety that's protected per se or an essentially derived variety. So next slide, please. So just to give you an example of the breeder's exemption, which is very closely, well, which is important to understand when we discuss these issues. And this is to just demonstrate how the breeder's exemption works. You have here in the center breeder 3. He wants to create a new variety, and he's using variety A, which has been protected by breeder 1 and created by breeder 1. And then he is using as well variety B, which is not protected and was created by breeder 2. What he has created is a new variety. He has a bred new variety, C. It is not an EDV in this example. And he could do that without the authorization of breeder 1. So the authorization of breeder 1 is not required. And the authorization of breeder 2, of course, not required either, because variety B is not protected. And in order to commercialize the variety, authorization of breeder 1 is not required either, and not from breeder 2. So that is in essence the breeder's exemption, which allows breeders to use all existing varieties, even though they are protected, in order to create new varieties and also commercialize them. But then we have the provisions on the EDV, and we can go to the next slide. So this is an example where you will see that breeder 2, he has created a new variety and has used a protected variety A to create variety B. And the variety B is an EDV, so an essential derived variety of variety A. And also in this case, authorization of breeder 1 is not required to breed variety B. However, authorization of breeder 1 is required to commercialize the variety B. So there is the difference. There is an extended scope of the protection for variety A in relation to EDVs. So we can go to the next slide. So can an EDV be protected in its own right? Can you apply for a variety, the EDV to be protected under a system? Yes, that's not a problem. How about, can the EDV then be commercially exploited? Well, it requires, as I said, the authorization of the PBR holder of the initial variety and the PBR holder of the EDV. So that is, in essence, a summary of the protection. We can go to the next slide, please. So just a couple of words about the initial variety. So a variety shall be deemed to be essentially derived from another variety, the initial variety, and the initial variety is not restricted to protected varieties, actually. However, if the initial variety is not protected, the holder of a protected EDV of that initial variety does not need the authorization to commercialize the EDV. Next slide, please. So that was very briefly the protection of EDVs, and I will now go into the group of guidance that have been developed for EDVs. So next slide, please. So in 2019, there was a seminar organized by UPOV on the impact of policy on essential derived varieties, EDVs, on breeding strategy. It was organized, this seminar, due to the fact that breeders were not fully satisfied with the wording of the explanatory notes that were existing at that stage. So next slide, please. Can you provide the next slide, please? Yes, so during that seminar, evidence was found that the current UPOV guidance did not reflect the practice amongst breeders in the understanding of EDVs. If you could click again, there will be more text coming up, please. So it was further concluded during this seminar that there was an evolution of breeding techniques that had created new opportunities, incentives for predominantly derived varieties from initial varieties more rapidly and at a lower cost. And discussions were mainly related to the new breeding techniques. And there was a clear indication from the presentations during this seminar that the understanding and implementation of the EDV concept influenced breeding strategy very much, and therefore it is important that UPOV guidance is tuned to maximize benefits to society in terms of maximizing also progress in breeding. So in essence, it was decided to open up the present EDV guidance. So next slide, please. So that happened, as I mentioned, in October 2019, and the CJJ decided to open up the explanatory notes for essentially derived varieties for revision. And 4 years later, this October, the UPOV Council adopted new explanatory notes on EDVs. And this sounds very simple, but a lot of things happened between 2019 and 2023. A lot of discussions took place in working groups, in seminars, but that requires almost an own presentation, so I will not go into the details. The good news is that the council adopted these new explanatory notes, and they can be found on the website of UPOV. And I will now go into a little bit of the contents of those new guidelines. So next slide, please. So first of all, just a reminder of the definition of essentially derived varieties in the convention. And it states that the variety shall be deemed to be essentially derived from another variety, the initial variety, when it is predominantly derived from the initial variety, or from a variety that is itself predominantly derived from the initial variety, while retaining the expression of the essential characteristics that results from the genotype or a combination of genotypes of the initial variety. Quite technical text, and I will come back to that. It should also be clearly distinguishable from the initial variety, which is a little bit more simple. It's more or less clearly distinguishable. Same definition as is used when you protect varieties, and then it's Article 7 of the UPOV Convention. And then lastly, the third criteria, except for the differences which results from the act of derivation, it conforms, so EDV must conform to the initial variety in the expression of the essential characteristics that result from genotype or combination of genotypes of the initial variety. So that's in the convention. You could take the next slide, please. And in the convention, in Article 45C, you also have examples on how to obtain an EDV, techniques used to come up with new EDVs. So that's a selection of a natural or induced mutant, selection of a somaclonal variant, selection of a variant individual from plants of the initial variety, backcrossing, or transformation by genetic engineering. So next slide, please. So going into what is predominant in these guidelines. So predominant derivation means that more of the genome of the initial variety is retained than would be retained by normal crossing and selection with different parents. So they start by they start by explaining this in the explanatory notes, the new ones. And the variety should only be considered predominantly derived from the initial variety if it attains almost the whole genome of its initial variety, so very closely. However, a degree of similarity alone does not automatically mean that the variety has been predominantly derived. So it should be very closely, but not the degree of similarity is not alone, and that does not automatically mean that the variety has been predominantly derived. Well, next slide, please. And then when you have varieties with a single parent, so it's called a monoparental variety, resulting for example, from mutations or genetic modification or genome editing, they are per se predominantly derived from the initial varieties. And that is also clearly stated in the new explanatory notes. And we can go to the next slide, please. Then varieties involving the use of two or more parents, so multi-parental varieties, they may be predominantly derived from one parent, so the initial variety, by selectively retaining the genome of the initial variety, for example, through repeated backcrossing. And here it is not then per se as it was in the previous case. In this case, it's suggested in the explanatory notes that crop-specific genetic similarity thresholds might be defined in order to determine predominant derivation. And there are examples of such thresholds adopted, for instance, by ISF, but also by other organizations. But the guidance encourages that is done. Then essentially derived varieties can be predominantly derived from a variety that is itself predominantly derived from the initial variety. So accordingly, essentially derived varieties can be obtained either directly or indirectly from the initial variety. Next slide, please. So it is required that the expression of the essential characteristics that result from the genotype or combination of genotypes of the initial variety is retained. Next slide, please. And what are then those essential characteristics? Well, there are examples in the explanatory notes. It could be morphological, it could be physiological, agronomic, industrial, for instance, oil characteristics and or biochemical characteristics. Those are only examples. It's not an exhaustive list, but there are examples of essential characteristics from a technical point of view. And then we can go to the next slide. So such essential characteristics, it is important that they are fundamental for the variety as a whole. So such characteristics should contribute to the principal features, performance, or value for use of a variety and be relevant for one of the following. So the producer or the seller, supplier, buyer, recipient, user of propagating material and or the harvested material and or the directly obtained products and or the value chain. So these are indications when characteristics are essential, and they should be as important for these for the whole value chain, say, or parties in this value chain. Next slide, please. Essential characteristics may or may not be characteristics used for the examination of distinctness, uniformity, and stability, and or used for the examination of value for cultivation and use, so the VCU and DUS characteristics. So it's not obligatory. It could also be other characteristics than those mentioned in such protocols on DUS and VCU. Next slide, please. Then another aspect which is very important is that the phrase in the convention that it is clearly distinguishable from the initial variety establishes that the variety concerned is required to be distinct from the variety. And as I said before, this is the same requirement as any variety that needs to be protected. So it should be distinct. I will not go more into those requirements here. So we can go to the next slide. So that was the second criteria. And then the third criteria, except for the difference which results from the act of derivation, it conforms to the initial variety in the expression of the essential characteristics that results from the genotype or combination of genotypes of the initial variety. And here it's very important, the conformity. It has been discussed a lot. Well, I would say since 1991, but very much recently when the new explanatory notes were adopted. And here it is now stated in the notes, explanatory notes, that there is no upper limit as to the number of differences between an EDV and the initial variety, which may result from the act of derivation. So there is no limit in the convention on this. That's important to note. The number of differences may vary, taking into account different methods of derivation and the differences which result from the act of derivation may also include essential characteristics. So next slide, please. So to go on, so the relationship between the initial variety, variety A, and an essential derived variety, for instance, B or C, is irrespective of whether a plant variety right has been granted to those varieties. And that is what I mentioned before as well. However, only if the initial variety is protected will the essentially derived varieties B, C fall within the scope of protection of the initial variety. So that has been clearly stated as well in the notes, in the explanatory notes. We can go to the next slide. So that was, in essence, briefly, some of the most important provisions in the new explanatory notes. It is also stated in the explanatory notes a little bit about the assessment of essentially derived varieties, who should decide on that. And
Side.
conformity of the essential characteristics. And these are both possible starting points in providing an indication that the variety might be essentially derived from the initial variety. So in essence, it is stated that breeders may seek ways to find this to resolve potential questions on whether varieties EDV or not between themselves at the first occasion. So next slide, please. So that was what is in the new guidelines. The discussions during the adoptions and before the adoption of the guidelines show that there are still a little bit different views on this topic. And for that reason, it was decided by the Council in October, after having adopted the explanatory notes, that it's important that there are updates from NUPO members and observers relating to the implementation of the concept of essentially derived varieties. And for that reason, there should be a standing item on the CAJ agenda to follow up what is happening, because there are new techniques coming up, there are different interests between different breeders and other stakeholders. So it's important that these issues are closely monitored. And based on relevant updates, the Council noted that the CAJ would advise on whether it would be appropriate to develop further guidance on essential varieties. So having adopted those guidelines, that does not mean that that is now forgotten. No, it will be a very close follow-up of what is going to happen on the market between breeders on this very important issue. So next slide, please. So thank you very much for your attention. It was a brief update of what has happened during the last month. And I'm happy to take questions now, or if that will be done later. So thank you very much for your attention.
So any question to Martin?
Okay. Difficult, huh? So now, huh?
You will have later.
Yeah, maybe you are right. So now I will invite Kevla for ISF presentation. Yeah, thank you, Martin. Presently, I have no questions, but we can have some questions. Martin,
Yeah. It has nothing to do with It's a very interesting. At the end of
Yes. Decision. And it's a great pleasure to present the Indigenous Federation. My name is Carla Mashra. I'm served as a regulatory affairs manager at ASC. I have to say, indeed, it's not my specialty, but I expect placing my colleagues so many things from my slides you see them by Martin, but I try to present them in a different way with a broader perspective. Oops. It's not working. Okay. So, as Martin has mentioned, so the concept has been introduced under the so it is in the Human Act, where we have a definition of individual, and then we have it's likely that provide guidance on the under this Human Act when there are provisions, assessment, and regulations. As I said, there are guidelines, and there have been several experiments so far. The first one was adopted in 2020, and there was a experiment was adopted in 2017, and this experiment in 2017 was made a lot of lessons to the developers, and the president of she's force is the industry. So, as Martin mentioned, the purpose of introducing this concept in the provision of the government up to 2014 to ensure sustainable development. And this will allow provide effective protection to the breeder, incentive to the breeder, and also encourage cooperation among breeders to development, especially of technology such as genetic modifications. So an example is highlighted here. We have a breeder one, it's created by the ITA, investigating represented by in this case, which is red. Then the second that indicates that graduation so we then invest and effort and the benefits from the specific condition of the characteristic of the Asian variety which was created by the breeder one. Therefore, I believe that we might take a lot of advantage and significant so and breeder one involves the share of the encouragement of the variety. Therefore, if the variety is considered as an equal, breeder one is protected and the breeder is encouraged to cooperate individually. And that's what Martin actually has mentioned just before, where the definition of under Article 35 states clearly the variety should be essentially derived from the variety, which is called the Asian variety,
when you have three different characteristics. So the first pillar is predominant derivation. The second one is distinguished as for any other protected variety. And the third one is high level of conformity. What do we mean by predominant derivation? Predominant derivation could be directly or indirectly to the initial variety. That is the case of indirect derivation when you have a variety which is itself derived from the initial variety. What is really important, it should be the expression of the essential characteristics, or what was called traits, that results from a genotype or combination of the initial variety. And then the second pillar is where you have, as I said earlier, it's to be distinguishable from the initial variety. The third level is a high level of conformity, which except for the active derivation, it should be conformed to the initial variety, the expression of its essential characteristics. That, of course, result from the genotype of the initial variety or the combination per se. And again, this is all was already mentioned by Andy, just in a different way. By methods, you can have selection of natural mutation, selection of semi-mutation, repeated backcrossing and transformation by genetic engineering. As you know, genome editing has been since a decade now. Discovered that this was not in the list. So it made a lot of issue interpretation of this type of derivation. So we are going to extract it in 2017. So what I'm going to do concerns from the news. And first thing was almost the totality of the initial varieties of the genotype. What do you mean by almost? You cannot say it's percentage, 100%, 99%, 80%. It's definitely there's interpretation. The second one is only one or very few differences in the active derivation. By different modification in regards to the initial variety. And the third one is essential characteristic must be so. And this matter of interpretation, what is derived, what do the differences in that, and then finally what does the conformity expected in play. So as mentioned, the videos about this. There have been several. The first one is really about the definition, which was stated already in the Fourth Convention and the Act. So that would result in the details right of the initial variety. Second one was one of the changes. And this is a very narrow scope. For example, one modification of essential characteristics by genotype would the scope of the so that's really a big issue. The second one, as I said, is this explanatory is not consistent with the definition that has been this definition is, as we call it, of number of modification. If you recall that scheme, the definition is really clearly stated. Modification. The fourth element is the explanatory does not reflect the goal also technology. And the last thing is the addition of such as green styles and so on. Decisions like that has created for predominantly variety, and this is really at a lower cost. This is the same example as the example I showed earlier. So there have been few elements in the experiment. So the first example is back crossing, where we have which is protected by the variety of the gene. So there we have predominantly that's clear. It reports all the essential characteristics of A except the disease. So then the last one is completely from A as a result of derivation, which means the variety B is the pathogen variety and is susceptible, so basically a clear case of EDV in this case. The second example is inducible pathogenesis, and this here we have a floral incarnation, which is when we change the color by different genes. The first one is it's split, and then the second one is a different individual. And here we have pathogenesis is a clear case as per its in 2017. So, what about genome evidence? So again, and here we have an example, so the variety transformed by any of genetic techniques. And then, let's say CRISPR Cas9, the variety, we can change one acid to recover disease resistance, what we call susceptibility genes. You have, is it any, that's questionable. Then also what the breeders do now, what we call multiplexing, you can create multiple characteristics in the row. That's why the breeders wanted to change. So how do you change this experimental mode? The breeders, see the logos here. So they made a task force. Then we have ISF, APSAS, UPI, you see ARSTA, and Good Life. They led by ISF, they did a combination and identified shortcoming of the experiment in 2017, and especially in the light of new genomic techniques. And they really requested the recreation of the working group, and then the idea was to contribute actively to this working group and explain how it is done by the breeders. So they formulated a proposal and explained the implementation and make sure in this new proposal of the DARS 2023 that the effort of the initial breeders are rewarded and the initial breeders continue to have this incentive to renovate. And again, back to the purpose of the and back to the definition that was stated in the of condition, the convention, Article 91. Article 14. So here is the explanatory note, and Martin did the explanatory 2023, which was adopted in the last October 27, 2023. And then I'm just highlighting a few things that already mentioned by Martin. The first element is the change in the derivation, where the breeders are happy with the clear emphasis on predominant derivation and a better definition of what we call essential characteristics as well. I will come back into that into the next slides. The second one is a very clear distinction, distinctness that change as per the article in Article 14 in the of convention. The third element where we have succeeded was high level of conformity, where we have no upper limits of the number of differences which may result from the active derivation, because that was really an issue and that was not coming back to the definition stated in the proof of act. So at this stage, you do a modification, no upper modification. That's really great. And then the last element is regarding the active derivation, where this explanation clarified that the differences resulting from this, again, the active derivation, whatever method it is, may also include essential characteristics. So the first element is where it's important, the predominant derivation, where the definition, the two criteria that for the breeders are important, we must retain almost the totality of the initial varieties genotype, here it's important to know that there have been separation, but explanation that high degree of similarity does not settle low, that does not automatically that the variety is predominantly derived. Example, progenies obtained from same cross, conversion, etc. And the second element, which was really important, is that this explanation made a clear differentiation between mono and multi-parental varieties. So in case of monoparental variety, we have a single parent, and then this could result from mutation, genetic modification, or genome editing per se. So this is really important. So that's predominant derivation, even genome editing is there. We have the second element of multi-parental variety. So of course, then you have to use one or two parents, and they can be derived from non-parent. In these cases, crop-specific genetic similarity threshold might be defined as ISF has worked also on some crops to define genetic similarity threshold, and this will be worked to improve. So in terms of essential characteristics, what again should be mentioned, it has changed really. It gave a better explanation and definition to this. It's fundamental for variety as a whole. That's an important statement. The second one, it should contribute to principal future performance or value of use. As you know, now with genome editing and the issue with climate change and consumer benefit, we need to use that technology in this sense. And this is also mentioned in the guidance. It should be also included and not to morphological or physiological phenotypes as it used to be in the previous experimental. As you know, the US is basically morphological, physiological. But then this was industrial phenotypes were included. For example, we have mice and biophenomenon of characteristics, characteristics, and then biochemical characteristics as well. The last element is these essential characteristics may or may not be used for examination in US testing of this mutation. So it's a bit larger. And then importantly, it may evolve over time. So the readers really welcome this experimental mode. It was a big discussion and consensus-driven element. And then just that the aforementioned organization declared that this new element is our understanding, the readers' understanding of the principle of engineering as it was stated in the Act. And the readers would like to ask all the members to adapt the national derived legislation to this interpretation of the principle so that we have a consistent approach in respect of EDV to be established. So how to apply this in practice for the readers and for what we understand from the explanatory mode? So in case of monoparental variety, we have a method, for example, which is mutagenesis. It could be induced, it could be targeted mutagenesis like gene editing. And then the assessment of productive variation is per se predominantly derived. So the assessment is typically EDV. So this is quite clear. But in the case of multiparental variety, where we have sexual crossing, for example, or hybrids, we need the crop-specific threshold for genetic similarity to assess. And as I said, ISF is working on this, and it would be case-by-case assessment. There are borderline cases which are unclear, and that's why we need to work as a reader community with people to better understand this. And these are the example of selfie, of maximum and grafting. The assessment is again, could be multiparental. So for some cases, it could be monoparental like for other cases. And again, a case-by-case assessment. So some key takeaway messages, really the adoption of the new explanatory 2023 is a huge achievement for the readers. And this case, the assessment of should be more straightforward, and there will be a fair return of the initial variety breeders to be counted, and that's where we come back to the purpose of EVB at the first interest. There are specific cases that are still to be discussed in Parliament, the breeders' organization, and to clarify how to apply this. And then there would be further experience with their experimental remote, which can be brought to the in 2024, as Martin has mentioned. Last but not least, this is my last slide. I would like to mention that, as you know, ISF is then opened, and ISF arbitration, trade and arbitration rules are currently under revision. And there would be specific provision on assessment of cases is proposed to be included in the arbitration rules. This is really important because these rules, arbitration rules, are applied by many seed companies all over the world, and the arbitration clause in contract as well. So very important to provide space for industry for implementation and enforcement. And with this, I would like to thank you for the attention. I'm happy to take any question. Thank you.
So thank you very much. I think we'll take questions in the last, maybe, because we listen to other panelists also here. So now Mr. Chris from the New Zealand.
Good afternoon, everybody. I feel quite honoured, to be honest, to participate in this forum because, as you will see, New Zealand has relatively little experience with EDV, but I thought it might be interesting to talk about how we've ended up with our new legislation and the aspects that we thought about and how that process went. I'm head of the Plant Variety Rights Office, which is part of the Intellectual Property Office of New Zealand, which is under a big organisation, the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. Now, the first few slides, I think things are very clear, but I think it's important that we understand some of the concepts and the terminology. We've heard about the dominant EVI, the dependent varieties and other things. So I don't think it hurts us to maybe have a look at them again. So first of all, the concept arose in the 1980s. And the concern was that it was the ability for the breeder to use particular varieties, which of course is a key part of the UK Convention, is to breed from predicted varieties. But at the same time, there's a need to acknowledge the breeding method in creating that initial predicted variety. So what we were looking at was, and in those times, was talking about fairness and balance. So we were doing one thing, but also it helped to make the other thing possible as well. So we can do this, as you've heard from Martin, we're included in the 1981 UK Convention. At that time, there was largely driven by genetic engineering. My former boss, he was involved in those negotiations, and he told me some interesting discussions on how they went, and it went on for quite some years. And as a result of that, it's been included in national legislation in the states some for over 20 years. So an interesting point that I think we should keep in mind is that it's not a new concept. It's been around for 30 plus years, but it's still topical. Now, why is that? I think largely it is centered around new breeding technologies. Originally, it was perhaps confined to mutations and other more limited areas of breeding. But now the scope has become much bigger, so therefore the the interest has expanded. Again, let's be clear about what they are. And again, we're going over some that we've already covered, but I don't think it hurts. Obviously, the variety must be predominantly derived from the protected initial variety. The variety must be clearly distinct, which of course is exactly the same as any other protected variety. Then looking at the differences, they must act result from the act of derivation. And I must conform to the initial variety with the expression of the essential characteristics. The production of the EDV does not require the repeated use of the initial variety. So, in that sense, an EDV can result from a whole range of breeding methods. There's actually no restriction. We've seen some examples of what might be possible, but I think we need to have an open mind on what breeding methods be used. Again, definitions I think are important. Again, this is a bit repetitive, but I think, as I said, I think it's worthwhile. So the initial variety, that's the single protected variety which provides the majority of the genotype for the subsequent varieties. And predominantly derived, this is rarely a retention of almost the whole genome, as we've already heard. The third variety is one that is not clearly distinguishable from the initial variety. And lastly, essential characteristics. These are traits that are determined by the expression of one or more genes, and they really contribute to the variety as a whole, its key features, performance, or value. So it almost provides the essence of the variety. So let's go back to the specific New Zealand situation. In our previous law, the Plant Variety Rights Act 1987, EDVs were not included. And of course, that law was based on the 1987 Import Convention, which also did not include any concept of EDVs. However, in the last 20 years or so, New Zealand breeders have had some familiarity with the concept of EDVs through contact with foreign breeders and protecting New Zealand varieties in other jurisdictions. So there is certainly a level of knowledge nationally and awareness of the principle. So the development of LVR law was a slow process. Initially, it was talked about in the 90s, not long after the 1991 convention was created. Again, it was looked at in the 2000s, but for various national priorities, it did not progress through the parliamentary system. So the development of the new law didn't really begin in earnest until 2018. In saying that, there was always an intention to include EDVs in any new law. It was not an area that was had any controversy or debate. One of the key things that we talked about during the policy development was around balance, because EDVs really is the concept of being fair to both parties. On the one hand, you have to protect the right to use protected varieties for breeding, often called the breeder's privilege. And that really is a cornerstone of the UPOV Convention. Again, on the other side, we have the interests of the breeder of the initial variety. They might have spent considerable time and effort and money, of course, into creating what perhaps the initial variety is successful, which is why someone else might wish to use it. So where is the balance in that relationship? And there was quite a lot of discussion about that. with respect to this importance of balance. So where did we find the balance? Well, actually, we ended up with Article 14.5 itself. The convention does have the balance. I think in that context, it is well constructed, and it met the requirements for fairness and the interest of both parties. I think it's also to note that we are not the first people to recognise that. There's a similar approach has been made for the majority of the legislation internationally. So I think that shows that it is an important document, important article to start with. So for countries that are developing EDV law, I think it is really where the starting point should be, rather than looking at picking up your own or variations of that. What we also learned, though, was that it can be looked at differently by different EPOG members. Development of the EDV provision was helped by the discussions that we've already heard about with the EPOG, without the revision of the EPOG guidance. The EPOG clearly demonstrated that there were some different views on the interpretation of aspects of the Article 14.5. And I think it showed that each member can have some limited flexibility regarding its own position within the boundaries of the article. So as long as I think that there is flexibility within the article, it is, from a national point of view, there's a decision is made on where that position you want to be. Well, I want to be more on the side of making it more difficult, or do you want to look at it from the point of view of making it perhaps some would say easier? Again, that's balance again, which is probably not so good for me because I'm unbalanced for a start. So the broad objective of the law was to have compatibility for the EDV provisions with other EPOG member states and with trading partners. So then that's another really important element that was considered. We looked overseas, we looked at what other countries were doing. So we have a new law. So it came into force in January this year, which was exciting for some. It didn't make the headlines though, because we got a new Prime Minister on the same day. So I guess that was more important. But I think it is a significant step, and it really is an improvement on what we had before. Importantly, it's not retrospective, which means that the EDV provision can only be applied to initial varieties protected under the new law. And as of today, there have no varieties yet protected under the new law. So EDVs, I think, is a ways off. As I said, we have no real experience, and I think it may be some time before we do. Another important consideration in developing law is what is the role of the authority. In our case, it was determined that the role of the authority is to determine if the second variety, assuming that it applies for protection, is sufficiently distinct from the initial variety. As I guess well, you can, of course, if the breeder of the second variety makes an application. So that is a central role of the authority. And again, it's no different than any other examination of a protected variety. The second role of the authority is that you must approve the nomination of the second variety. So that is also exactly the same for any other protected variety. Now, our legislation has not provided any role for the authority in operating the new EDV provisions. So the identification, assertion and management of EDVs is entirely a matter for breeders and variety owners. Very similar in a way to infringement and related activity. So this, I think, really understands why you as breeders have such interest in this, because it is really you who will be making decisions and making judgments, not necessarily the authority. Therefore, the role of the breeder is crucial. The breeder of the initial variety, it's up to them to take whatever action they see appropriate. When you make a claim, it's potentially essentially derived. What does that mean? How does that function when you're looking at breeder to breeder? The breeders can resolve the situation as they see fit by various means, dispute resolution, any consensus, contract, and possibly civil litigation. So again, it's really up to the breeder how this is managed. And perhaps there's room for some of the LIFO principles around dispute resolution could well fit well with resolving issues around EDV. This approach to the legislation is, again, very similar to what is occurring in most UPOV member states that have EDV provisions. So again, it's about having something in common with other authorities, a common national approach, and but where does that, what's happening here? There was a lot of, initially there was quite a focus on vegetatively propagated varieties. They've received particular attention, especially around mutations. And for us, apple is a particular species that is important to us economically. There is breeding here. And by coincidence, it naturally mutates quite frequently. Perhaps more so than many other species. So we really see potential EDVs in apples through natural mutations. So perhaps the first EDV, whenever that will be, in New Zealand will come from this species. And that is somewhat of a guess, but I think it's perhaps has some probability. So what can we learn from other territories? Again, when you don't have experience at home, you've got to look elsewhere, as we have done working through our legislation. This is in the public record. Some of you may be aware of the case surrounding a Gypsophila variety, and there was a case in Israel and one in the Netherlands. And they came out with different outcomes. Now, why that occurred, I'm not sure, but some have speculated that it's not so much about the EDV principles, but about the legal process. Conventional breeders have expressed some concerns about new breeding technologies. There's an element of unease about what is possible now. You know, conventional breeding is you know much more than myself. It takes a long time. You may have spent a decade producing a variety, and then potentially someone comes along with new breeding technologies and it's changed, not quite overnight, but in a relatively short period. So this is some of the talk that we have heard. There has been a lot of focus on EDVs around natural and induced mutations. I've heard some examples in the already this afternoon on mutagenesis. That clearly is the case where you have a single parent and you potentially have a small change to the genome to produce something that's quite interesting and different. And the last one, EDVs are essentially a legal concept. And yet we tend to look at it technically. I think there's a little bit of a friction between the legal perspective and the technical one. We might understand things quite well technically, but from a legal angle, it's not the same. So it's an element that I would say is an interesting, not entirely a contradiction, but it's the way you look at this topic and can have some different outcomes. So in conclusion, we have legislation, we have EDVs. It's taken a long time to be developed. It's quite important to look at what's happening elsewhere within and other foreign legislation. And again, I really recommend that those who are looking to introduce EDVs in their legislation, please look what's happening elsewhere. I think there may be some time before EDV provisions will be used. I'd say, first of all, we need to grant a right under the new law is an important starting point. And finally, sort of back to sort of where I started, EDV is more than 30 years old. It's not really new, except the questions continue and also the debating. So thank you very much. It's actually a little bit longer than I thought, because initially when I was asked about New Zealand experience with EDVs, I thought we were quite short. So I think I've managed to produce something a bit better. So again, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. I don't know whether it is becoming easier for you to understand and more complex is becoming. So let us see in the end, because there is a different perspective, legal, technical, complexities are there. Thank you very much, Chris. So we will take questions later. So now I will ask Dr. Han, as a China perspective now.
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for inviting me to give a brief introduction of our EDV practice in China. So, my name is Richard Han. So, in fact, I'm recommending the use of molecular expertise in our institutions. So, maybe this afternoon I will provide some insights from the technical aspects. So in 2021, we amended our seed law. The revision, we have four main parts. The first one is the expand the protection scope from the protecting materials to the harvesting material. And the second one is to extend the protection chain, because in the previous version, we just the scope of revise just limited in the production, reproduction, and selling. After the amendment, so it's expanded to chains. This is quite convenient for the rights holders. They can, in case there is an infringement, it is very useful for them to provide proof. And the third one is to improve the compensation for the infringement. And the last one is the we established the EDV system. So in the Article 19, in the seed law, provide the definition of the EDV. So here I just list the definition in Chinese. But in fact, we follow the UPOL that's concept of the EDV and also the scope of the initial varieties. Initial variety holders are the same. So we follow the UPOL rules. And then there's a very important article that is Article 28, the steps and measures for the implementation of EDV shall be formulated by the State Council. So that is how to implement this new system is not included in the seed law. So that means we need to develop some approaches to implement it. So why we introduce EDV? The main goal is to stimulate the original innovation, and solve the problem of the variety homogeneity. As you might know, we have a large number of applications every year. In 2022, the application number is more than 11,000, which account for almost 46% among UPOL members. So the number is very high. So some of the variety, the quality is not so good. So that's why we want to establish the EDV system. How to implement it? Last year we conducted a survey, and more than 1,800 questionnaires are received. All those concerns can be divided into 6 categories. The first one is the concept and how to interpret the EDV conception. So I think most Chinese breeders, they are not familiar with this concept, especially how to integrate, because this afternoon presenters, they say like the concept of essential characteristics. And the second one is the steps of implementation for all crops or for some of the crops. And the third one is the variety breeders. They bred varieties use new technologies. For example, gene editing. In this case, sometimes they claim that they have made a lot of contribution to the EDV variety. So in this case, they think they shouldn't pay a lot for the initial variety holder. And the fourth one is the technical identification, how to assess a variety is an EDV or not. And also the mechanism of benefit sharing, how much money they should pay. And in case there is a dispute or infringement, how to solve this problem. So after that, we have taken some measures. The first one is the EDV dissemination. Last year during the China State Congress, we invite some experts to give some presentations to explain the concept of the EDV, and also for the Martin introduce the ISF rules on the matter of EDV. And we also posed the 10 frequently asked questions on the social media. So we currently we have 4 considerations for the EDV implementation. The first one is the step-by-step strategies, because most of the application focus on the agricultural crops, such as maize, rice, wheat, soybean. And we want to develop guidelines for the graders in case they have when there is infringement occur, they can provide some guidelines for them. And the third one is we want to select some institutions to provide the technical support. Both the phenotype, like the US subcenters in China, they can provide the identification, use the phenotype method, and also some institutions they can provide the support by use the genotyping method. And the last one is we want to establish expert committee because for the EDV it's a very professional issue, especially when there is no molecular method or standard. So these experts committee, they can provide some professional advice on this matter. So in relation to the assessment of EDV, the UPOM explanatory note 3 provide a very clear way. So we also follow this this method. So for ISS, they have developed guidelines for 6 crops. Some of crops they use the DE method, and some use the characteristics. So for us, we prefer to use the molecular method because it is very easy to do that. And currently, we have released more than 20 or 30 standards which could be used in the variety identification. Most of those standards we use the SSR markers, but when those standards are used in the assessment, the number of the markers is very small. So the result of the genetic similarity might not so precise. So in this case, we are trying to develop new technical standards for EDV assessment. So in here we use SMP markers and also MMP markers. For example, for rice, these standards has been reviewed by a group of experts. In these standards, we use the 1,000 MMP markers, while for the maize crop, we use the microarray contain 14,000 SNP markers. These standards are still under development. And the last one is we initiate a pilot project on EDV. In fact, we started this work in from 2020. The first crop is rice, and this year we start another 3 crops: maize, soybean, wheat. So breeders from scientific institutions or companies, they join this group. They join the pilot project. So they will discuss together, and finally they will make agreement on use what kind of method for the identification and the threshold, also the benefit sharing and the resolution for the dispute. So that's all my presentation. So as
as the Chris said, we just start this work. In fact, we are looking forward to some cases. We want to learn from the cases how they implement the EDV system. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Han. So now we move to Mark. Is there online?
Yes, so Mark is here with us. Mark, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Please wait a moment. We can see you now, but we don't hear you yet.
Okay, why don't you try this? I see you,
Okay.
Puna.
Yes, so we can hear you very well. Let us switch the
Very
screen.
good.
Yeah, let us
So Mark,
switch.
please go ahead.
Yes,
Yeah.
please.
Yeah, Mark, it's your turn now.
I will try to find the share button. Here we go. And you should now see my screen.
Yes.
Is it okay, everybody?
Yes, can you make it to full screen? It's not yet in full screen.
Right. Here we go.
Yes, perfect.
Very good. Excellent. Well, thank you and welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming to this session. So my name is Mark Kuhl with Corteva AgriScience, and I really want to look at EDV from a practical breeder's perspective, how we use the concept in our breeding programs. So the couple of topics I will focus on is indeed, why do we need an EDV system, how it works in practice, and what maybe the future could hold for us. These pictures here on the right I find very interesting. The top right picture is actually a PVP trial in cereals. And as you can see, everything looks really, really similar or visually practically the same. But none of these are EDVs. These are PVP trials, and none of those varieties are EDVs. And on the bottom right, you can see a number of morning glory flowers, and they all look visually very, very different. But in fact, they are all pure EDVs from each other with simple point mutations. So this shows a little bit the difficulty of understanding and implementing the concept of EDV, because visually it tells you something different than what it does kind of genetically and what it does according to the definitions of EDV. So let's dive into that a little bit. So EDV is really a way to balance PVP and the breeder's exception under PVP to drive innovation. And in fact, the balance is really between the protection that PVP affords you and the breeder's exemption, which gives other breeders access. Those two things always need to be in balance, and that best drives innovation short-term, but also long-term. And EDV is really a critical principle to help achieve that balance. So I know that Dr. Han just covered some of this very well, but there's really three criteria under UPOF to for the definition of EDV. One is the predominant derivation itself. The other is that the EDV is clearly distinguishable or distinct from the initial variety. And then number three is, except for what you did in breeding steps to create the EDV, everything else should be the same. So those are three very, very clear conceptual elements to an EDV definition. You do notice under point number one, this term essential characteristics. And this term has been quite confusing over time. There is, as you are likely well aware, UPOF has just updated its explanatory note on EDV a month ago. And in that new explanation, it confirms that it doesn't matter how many or how few essential characteristics, and it doesn't really matter what type of essential characteristics you're describing. That is not the important thing for determining EDV. What's important is was it derived? Is it distinct? And except for what you did to develop it, is everything else the same as the IV? So those are 2 or 3 clear things for us to keep in mind. Now, briefly on UPOF itself, 2 of the primary UPOF conventions are UPOF 78 and UPOF 91. You can see that mostly in Asia, most of the countries are not signatories of UPOF 91. 2 main differences between UPOF 91 and earlier UPOF acts is the concept of EDV, and then also that protection has been extended to harvested material, which is mostly an issue and a big issue with vegetatively propagated crops like ornamentals and trees, etc. You notice also that I will point out China, as Dr. Han just mentioned, has signed on to UPOF 78, however, has implemented a EDV system in their new PVP regulations. So a couple of comments about some testing systems, because sometimes these can be a little bit confusing. It's important to point this out. So one is a system that we often use in breeding, which is really about fingerprinting. So are you able to hear me okay still, Kuna? So genetic fingerprinting is really to answer the question, who am I as one individual, one variety? It's usually a small number of markers. It provides a DNA profile like it does with humans, and it's used to identify one unique individual. Another test is the distinctness test, such as also more and more used under UPOF as a descriptor. And that is really to identify if that individual is different from other individuals. So therefore could apply for PVP. And that's a standard marker set. It shows differences, and usually the use of this system is in a pairwise comparison, comparing variety A from variety A to see if they're different. When we talk about EDV type discussions and questions and concerns, we're really talking about a similarity test. In other words, how similar are these 2 varieties? Are they related? Is there some kind of dependency? Is there a common pedigree? What is the relationship between these varieties? That also is a standard marker set, but it's a marker set intended to show similarities and therefore genetic conformity. So those are kind of the 3 types of tests that we often use. To dive a little bit further into the difference between distinctness, which is a PVP attribute, and EDV status. So let's say there's a variety X being compared to a protected variety A. And obviously for EDV, we're talking about an essential derivation from a protected variety. If a variety isn't protected, it's a landrace or it's a public variety or it's out of PVP, then this whole discussion does not apply. But in the case of a protected variety A, that variety X can be compared to that variety using any number of different types of traits, such as morphological traits, agronomic traits, DNA markers, etc. In case 1, that variety X is seen to be exactly the same as variety A. So of course that variety X is not new, and this whole discussion doesn't apply either. But what if that variety X is quite close to variety A? What happens then? So in this case number 2, this variety X, because it is distinct, it can be distinguished from protected variety A, it can obtain a PVP certificate. But if it's proven, and we'll go into this in a moment, that it is essentially derived, which means pretty much meeting those 3 criteria I mentioned before, then commercializing that variety X requires the PVP holder A's approval. That is very simply the system that breeders maintain. And then there could be a case 3 where this variety X is so far removed genetically from variety A that it is not essentially derived. It is outside the scope of PVP for variety A, and the PVP or the breeder of variety X is able to get PVP and then freely commercialize that variety. So this kind of shows a red area, they're the same, an orange area, they're kind of close, and a green area, no, they're quite far apart. So how do you see if they're close, a little bit the same or far apart? As again, Dr. Han, I'm glad I dialed in to see that. As Dr. Han mentioned, there are a number of molecular marker techniques you can use, MNPs, SNPs, SSRs, etc. Importantly is the comment that these are crop specific. So in order to develop a EDV test, you must develop a technical guideline which has thresholds. The way to do that is to take an appropriate germplasm set of known germplasm where you know the pedigrees, you know the dependencies, you know the similarities, and you're able to apply a set of molecular markers on that genetic environment, and you're able to then see if what you know about those varieties is indeed validated through this molecular testing. So then you can say the molecular test on the opposite would be able to then tell us these dependencies between these varieties. It's important that you use public markers for that. It's also important to use all the genetic diversity available so that the SNP data set the SNP database that you use is very widely usable. You look for a genetic similarity method, as I mentioned. Then you assess the genetic similarities. You then adopt thresholds, and then you can establish guidelines for that testing methodology and for those thresholds. Again, the thresholds are based on the known dependencies that you've tested for. If you know variety X is essentially derived from variety A, and it has this much genetic difference, then you can use that threshold also in assuming and assessing differences and similarities between other germplasms. A very critical point underlined on the bottom, and this has been particularly clarified in the most recent UPOF explanatory note, is that commercial value, except for one country that I'm aware of, is not a factor to determine EDV. So if a variety has a benefit such as a pest resistance, and that maybe is an economically, from a societal and farmer's perspective, an important characteristic, there's value in that, but that alone does not allow it to escape from being an EDV. If it meets the three criteria of an EDV, it still is an EDV. There is actually UPOF Act, and Martin is here, so I think it's actually clause 15, Martin can correct me, that says that if there is a big commercial societal value, then there can be an obligation posed on the initial variety holder to grant a commercial license. License is still required, but there can be, in some very rare cases, a mandatory license imposed, but it still is an EDV regardless of commercial value. So globally, ISF has actually put together testing methodologies and thresholds for exactly 6 crops, the 6 crops you see there, and you can go on the ISF website to have a look at their systems and their thresholds. So EDV in practice, how do we as breeders use this? The next 2 slides are kind of focusing on this topic. So one is we just talked about developing an EDV system. The reason for doing so is to make sure that it is clear that intellectual property rights are balanced with access, and that those drive breeding, which creates innovation, which helps create value for society and farmers. That is the reason for an intellectual property system. But there can be disputes. When there is a dispute, so let's say that breeder variety A has suspicions that variety X is an EDV, what do? Number one, they can use agreed on standard methodology, use molecular markers, and determine this genetic conformity or similarity using ISF methods for these 6 crops I mentioned, and trying to use other methods to show genetic similarities which are acceptable by both parties. Based on the threshold that you've established, It can either clearly be an EDV or clearly not be an EDV, or it can be within that bandwidth of, well, it's really close, but not sure if it really is essentially derived or dependent or genetically conform. We need to look further into that. What happens then is there's a so-called reversal of burden of proof, where the variety X must now prove that it's not a EDV. The way to do that usually is by reviewing the pedigrees and breeding methods to show, well, I developed this, which is very close to your variety, but I did it this way from these varieties having nothing to do with your variety, and I can show that clearly on paper, and that would be sufficient evidence to then escape from being seen as an EDV. But if you go through your breeding records and it shows that you took this variety A and you developed, did some breeding on that exactly from that one variety, then very likely it's going to be tough to prove you're not an EDV. So if there's proof that this is an EDV or not, then the breeder X can then ask for a commercial license and still be able to sell this variety and still provide this value to farmers. However, if breeder A doesn't agree, or if breeder X doesn't agree, it's been proven to be an EDV, then there is a way to go to an ISF arbitration panel to help decide the case. That is the preferred approach within the seed industry. But if there's still disagreement after that, clearly, of course, always both parties can still go to the court system. So one thing to mention here, and I'm sure Chris mentioned this earlier as well, is that the PVP office's role is to put laws in place per the UPOF Act that has been signed and per, of course, the laws of the country, and then review PVP applications against those laws and determine if a new variety application should be granted a PVP certificate, yes or no. If it is, then they grant a PVP certificate, and that's where the PVP office's responsibility ends. The breeder is in charge of surveillance, so making sure that they know what material is out there being sold, and the system I described above with the reversal of burden of proof and with an arbitration system, and eventually an enforcement through a judicial system is then a next step, but none of that is the responsibility of the PVP office. So how about a breeder? What do we, example, as a breeder do, under the EDV concept? It's really quite straightforward. So the concept is that breeders have agreed to a system. So the breeders know the rules and they can make sure they don't develop EDVs. Most breeders, or all breeders, really don't want to develop an EDV. They would rather develop varieties that have value that they've created and sell that and earn the money from those sales and reinvest that in their program and not have to deal with this idea of EDV. So the EDV concept shows them kind of what the guardrails are and how they can stay away from developing an EDV. An important point here, and this is something really I think to keep in mind, is that although there are legal pathways under the EDV system and concept, up front, the EDV concept isn't a legal system. A legal system is something in place to solve a problem afterwards. But what the EDV concept does is up front gives breeders guidance on how to develop new varieties, how to stay away from infringing on the rights of others, and how to continue to develop value for farmers and society. So it's an operational or breeding system. So that's really an important point in my mind. So then number two is, there is a standard testing determination system if there are questions. But because all the breeders together develop this rule book, the breeders also have a standard rule book that they all agree to and they all can use in determining the success of their breeding program and where they get germplasm sources, etc. Then number three, enforcement. So if somebody doesn't follow these rules, then the nice thing about this EDV system is that breeders themselves have developed the rule book, so they all understand the rule book, and under the rule book, breeders can make claims for enforcement and make claims for a solution for that problem. So it really is a breeder-driven type of a approach, and the concept of EDV is in its core very simple. Don't take one variety, do something really little genetically that might make it look really different, but really isn't very different, and try to call that your own variety. That concept is, in its core, quite straightforward. So how about the future? So in the future, there should be and there will be additional EDV systems developed, so methodologies and thresholds for additional crops like soybean is we're on the cusp of having that completed, rice, various vegetable crops, etc. Although, as also clarified in this new explanatory note, the breeding method itself really does not have an impact on the development of EDVs. It's clear that certain breeding methods, say crossing and selection, naturally avoid EDVs because you're mixing up whole genomes and there's going to be no dependency or genetic conformity. But other breeding methods like gene editing or others, because they make such targeted, precise changes, those could lead to EDVs. And there will be in the future additional technologies that may or may not more easily create EDVs. But the concept of EDV itself really is not dependent on the breeding method. It's more what you did and what the outcome is. And then as we've always had in mind as breeders over the last number of decades, there really needs to be a balance of intellectual property protection with breeders' rights and recognizing farmers' rights and farmer value. So that was what I wanted to say, and I thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you. So now, any question to Kaula? I think rest are coming again for answering many questions. Maybe you are. Yeah. You have.
I have a question for Martin.
Martin. Martin is not, I think, he is, yeah. So, any question from the vegetable breeders? Because it's more complex there. I think it is. Yes, please.
This is I guess some difference in the essential characteristics. So what is the percentage of differences, or what is the parameters to measure that differences? Parameters that in agencies, distinction.
You want to say something to that?
She's okay.
In terms of essential characteristics, is as it mentioned in the definition, is any trait. But then the percentage per se that there is one, but no limit to the modification. So that's really clearly stated now in the explanatory note.
Okay.
Does that help?
How one in variety for question. Suppose what are the parameters that you want to know? How much percentage differences?
Yeah, that's where it's not there is no clear clarification. It's almost so a part of the act of derivation. The whole genome should stay, but depends on the act of derivation how many modification. But it could be one, it could be those numbers, and it's in that sense there is no percentage.
There is a similarity threshold.
Exactly, similarity threshold.
Similarity threshold, which is prescribed by ISF in certain crops. So we say if it is 85% is 85 and beyond is maybe EDV. Less than 85. It's just indicators initially by the some of the molecular markers and some of the genetic similarity indexes which are derived through using different methodologies. But yes, but mostly is that you maintain the genome, which is more important, and you are by the breeding methodology, you drive certain things which are identifiable to say that it is a EDV.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Anything else you want to add?
Case of monoparent.
Yeah. Yeah, there's no limit to the number of modifications. Yeah, there's no limit to the modifications.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Any other question? Yes.
This is Gong Zhu from Base Seed. So we provide utility services for cross-border seed companies. So I have a question regarding the example. Can you give us some viable examples in situations where a variety is deemed essentially an EDV of a particular initial variety that it falls in smallest difference of the EDV. So in that situation, the burden of proof shifts. So in that situation, what are the possible defense that a breeder can make? That even though it is similar enough, it falls in the smallest the gap, but it's not an EDV. So I'm just looking for the examples. Thank you.
An example?
Like what are the possible defense in this situation? So it doesn't when it falls in the smallest difference, like for example using the IMP or ISMP method, it only means that the burden of the shift, the burden, shifts. But still, it's possible for the breeder to give them defense. So, what are the viable defense that you can think of? Thank you.
I think you have example of lettuce, maybe, because lettuce is a very close by all the more than 95% similarities, and it's the difference between 95 and absolute 99%. So there are burden of proof. Yes, initial burden of proof is with the protected variety holders, and when this challenge, the burden of proof shifts to the person who developed that variety, which is called EDV. But yes, the smaller differences are a challenge. This is the implementation part of it. And I think most of the offices, they are facing this issue. And still we have to see that the new definition may change some scenarios, we'll see. Because it is more clear things now defined, the number of differences are not now mentioned that 1 trait or 10 traits or so it is a much better definition, we call it. But let us see how it has been implemented in different scenarios, in different examples which we get. Yes, please. Yes, yes.
How that and also it is the essential character of the variety. Slides.
What exactly you say? You want to know the essential characteristics of variety?
Essential characteristics, it should be very good. That is the main criterion.
Yes.
So, how you can by different aspects.
There are different methodology are being used as SNPs are now people are using it to differentiate the similarity index. So there are people are using now methodologies, and few crops they have already standardized by ISF, which the all protocols are published there, and rest people are establishing the facts that. But there are some challenges in these things. I told you as I think lettuce is the first example. I think Francois will be knowing better than the lettuce is a very, very close system. So there, some of the very close system people are facing the issue of essential characteristics, what you call, because there the differences are different. Yeah. Now I think we should move to. Thank you very much. You can talk to the people here who are sitting here, experts. So now we move to the next part, which is the session which Francois is. So Francois, stage is yours.
Yes, so I like to please, we welcome JC and EDJ. Thank you very much. Yeah, well, I think my accent has, yeah, quite bad. Yes, my Chinese is not good. So, other than myself, we didn't use a lot of time to describe the impressive thing of the people. I want to book and find what things we are doing with the intensive speakers we have to do for this discussion. So what I propose is to have a first round of questions for you. And after maybe we engage some discussion and we may take some provision of the floor. So my first question will be for Chris, because you explained clearly that you have not, because it's very big habit of EDV implementation or EDV contest. But you said something which is interesting for me as a non-year. You said that even for you, it's possible to have a social derived variety with natural mutation. And you took the example of apple. And so I wonder if the past of conventional breeding 100 years was to varieties. And so my question to now that a variety which is obtained by a natural mutation, which is the lack of conventional breeders, will become an EDV.
I think there always, I think, not always, but I think there has been concern about mutations. This goes back to, I said in the 1980s, there was some concern about, and that led to the changes that were introduced to the 1991 convention. So I think there always have been some concerns. However, what has happened, I think, in the last 10 years is the consciousness that this, with new breeding technologies, will happen more often, that the frequency will increase, and therefore it's going to affect more crops. I mean, we know that natural mutations, there are some genera that are more likely to mutate than others. In Prunus, it's not so common. In Malus, it's relatively frequent. So I think those sort of species, and also rose was another key one as well. So I think why this interest has increased is because now it is more likely, and I think it's becoming more economically significant. I think that would be my answer to that one.
If I are a research person, how can you manage this concept of how you to find a lot of activities. I know this is somewhere about your organization.
Thank you. Kia ora. Not a research person, General Manager of Plant Varieties. So, General Manager at the New Zealand Institute of Plant and Food Research, where we breed initial varieties and sometimes EDVs as well. How do we manage this concept? Very carefully and usually contractually. What's really important for us is clear contracts, and that's not just me thinking that they're clear or written clearly. That's having good quality conversations with the partners that we work with. So the nurseries and the growers and all parties who have access to our materials, so that we have a mutual and clear understanding. The piece that gives us the most concern is that our varieties might be considered an EDV or what we would consider an EDV of our varieties might be considered one in one jurisdiction and not in another. And that's where our biggest concern is.
Okay. I saw that so what is your opinion about that?
So, highly process-free international, so kiwi fruit marketer, international kiwi fruit marketer. So, yes, to echo Emma's concern, of course, we market in over 52 countries worldwide. And so, the concept that you might have something classified as an EDV in one country and not in another, when you have a lot of export and movement from one country to another, a lot of contracts that are cross-jurisdictional, those are really challenging issues for us. But, it is a concern, but we do see EDVs as an opportunity as well. And I like to encourage people to look at this in three ways. One is preparing for proactively, so really keeping a close eye on the competitors, the breeding programs, actually really proactively monitoring, having a watch system in place, which is what we do, because you need to know what's out there, to know what might be coming up as a problem in each country. So having that proactive preparation, having the watchers is keeping an eye on the breeding programs, engaging with the breeding programs, not just sitting back and waiting for it to hit you, but actually engaging with them. And then looking at it as an opportunity as well. Could this be an opportunity to diversify your income instead of it just eroding value from your company? So there is that opportunity, and also the opportunity to look at, perhaps extending the life of your plant variety, right? We have a limited right, and EDVs do have the opportunity, if you can work with and negotiate with the EDV owner to actually extend the life in terms of income, in terms of variety, and disrupting the disruptor and breeding from that EDV. So introducing more genetic material, which is really beneficial. And then, you know, for us, it's always about increasing the moat. So making that moat bigger. So not just relying on the plant variety, right, or the EDV, but actually on all the tangible assets. So your trademarks and brands, you know, the networks and relationships, the regulatory approvals that enable you to actually create that value. So yes, it's certainly a concern, and you know, we've got a lot of countries to consider, but there's also a lot of opportunities, and I think so. You know, somehow we can be very proactive, be really proactive about it now. Once somebody applies, you've got a couple of years at least before it's granted, so that you can actually prepare, and that you can actually look at it as an opportunity and identify more value, and that you can do what you can to increase your own moat, to maintain that moat and create more value for your own company.
John, what experience with second time, as I bunch of countries where such as different, as far as so that's the second time. Thank you very much, sessions which that come back with the best explanatory process 2023. So so it's got successfully implemented in Japan, and you know, but when it comes to but we have special legislation where the rights are protection of plant varieties and also the farmers' right also. So what we look at the farmers' right, where basically that farmers, so the extent variety is also considered that protected. And 2004 also defined also. You can register also, and once you register, you passport data authorities after going to the testing, testers, and then it is open to the protection journal, and they leave it for 2 months. So if anybody has objections, they can raise objections. But PVP authority, as Chris mentioned, also cannot deny the registration of the also. So they can register, and to come back to variety and consensus and agreement. Then of course it can be registered also. But mostly they nomenclature and objections, then it is registered as a variety also. So it's sort of, you know, does not say we don't recognize EDV, it's recognize EDV, define EDV system also. And we as a breeder feel that we don't want to people also ask the breeder, you know, how do you derive variety, what is your predictive system, which method you follow, it's goes back. And sometimes there is positive favor, sometimes negative also, you know, from legal terms. So what personally I feel from Sakata as a breeder's point of view, of course, under full breeder exemptions, you know, every breeder, you know, they can look into what is the best commercial variety and they try to use it. But if you use it one time is okay, but you know, repeated use, or if it is, you know, just trying to do cosmetic breeding. So I think in that way, you know, is very essential so that the initial breeder does not suffer. So this is our view that initial breeder contribution should be recognized, and there should not be like cosmetic breeding. And at the same time, if anybody want to use the NBT or, you know, quickly want to introduce or commercialize, then the EDV breeder has to have a pre-agreement or consensus, agreements. Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
we are no more.
Sorry, I'm sorry for so.
So sorry. Just talk about cosmetic which is clearly in cosmetic breeding. We said that of each essential characteristic variety and sure. Like for example, now the latest explanatory notes are very well defined. There is no limit of essential characters, also no limit for number of traits by act of variations. So it is very well. So that cosmetic breeding, which was prior to 2017 notes, it is now out of review. But like for example, if you want to register an EDV variety, and if there is a no initial variety which is not protected, then you can register the EDV also. But that is only the EDV breeders knows it. And looking into the passport data, if the variety initially is protected, then you can raise the objections, and for mutual consent only you can register the variety. Yeah. So regarding rights. How you imagine the case of your office in any conflict or any problem regarding ETV? Steps skill, for example, in scrubs in some of the crops in the scope of the EDV. Back to starting steps and others in the regulation, is still under the assessment of the Ministry of the Justice. So, they have a very high reflection of the EDV. For us, for the just really just some legal aspects, for example, the regulation, and also technical aspects, for example, rules of the standards to provide the support for the assessment. I think there is also a challenge for the dissemination of the EDV, as I mentioned in my presentation, because people now they use the new breeding technologies, for example, genome editing. So sometimes we think this is a method is quite useful to breed a new variety, but from their side, they think it is very difficult to change the characteristics.
So in this case, they claim that, so they sometimes they argue in this case, the second variety shouldn't be a EDV variety. But if we follow the rules of the UPOV, it's sometimes in this case from a monoparent variety. In this case, it is a typically EDV. So we in my work, sometimes I need to take a lot of efforts to explain the concept and the UPOV rules of EDV. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question. I don't know for each of you. I didn't understood clearly what would happen if I recognize I create an EDV. I go to the breeder of initial variety, and he doesn't allow me to sell or to find an agreement with him. Is it anything I may use? Is it in New Zealand legislation or China legislation? Is it something which allows me to oblige the initial breeder to give me a license?
We have nothing specific in the legislation for that instance. But I think if we go back to what EDB provides the opportunity for joint commercialization. It has nothing to do with ownership. So therefore, it might be a courtesy for the second breeder to go and talk to the first breeder. But if the first breeder says no, well, the second breeder has a distinct variety, it may be protected, he owns it, I guess then he can do as he pleases. And if the initial variety wants to take it further, then that's a matter for the courts or other dispute resolution. It's an interesting situation. But I think the key thing is that what does EDB provide? Provides opportunity for commercialization. It's not about ownership or asking permission.
As company, have you?
Yeah, it's a very
this situation.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It's more linked to the commercial angle, marketing angle. Suppose the initial variety breeder feels my variety is going into a market, or somewhere I have the dominant position, and the variety which has been EDB, it has been derived by the breeder, and I don't know where they are targeting. So if it is a new market or some additional market or some additional, then the initial breeder might discuss with the management, okay, this is a variety derived from our initial variety, but EDB is targeting some other market. It's not going to hurt the initial variety market. So then the initial variety breeder might say, okay, let's sit down, let's talk to the agreement, and they can give the mutual agreement also. And also like in Indian also, like EDB or any variety which is very specific importance to the society or to the human or to the plants or to the there. So there is a provision of compulsory licensing also there. You cannot deny it also if the variety is important to the society or to the to the environment or to the harmony, or those kind of things are also defined in Indian laws. So they have a provision for compulsory licensing.
Okay.
Yeah, Francois, if I may, if you can hear me.
Yeah, so, Mark, you yes, are back.
I am back. The audio is very, very good now. Thank you to the technical people. And I'm sorry I'm having trouble, but it's my fault for not being there in person. So apologies. Okay. But number one, indeed, as Dr. Singh says, under UPOF law, I believe it's clause 15, but I can be corrected. There is indeed a provision for a compulsory license if the value of the product merits it. There still will be a license, so there still is the relationship between two parties, but that is a possibility. The other thing I would say is that if somebody accesses a initial variety, the reason they do so is because there's value there. They're not just choosing a random variety and then breeding that. They're doing it because they're starting with value that they think they can augment. They can take away a or some of the shortcomings of that variety. So in that case, what would be smart is before spending money on that and before doing your breeding work is go to the IV owner and say, I think I can take your variety. I think I could do this and this and this, which you can't do or have not done, and develop a new variety of value. Would it then be a worthy discussion for us to have to talk about a royalty in a commercial license agreement? So an EDV isn't created by accident. It's created on purpose. So when a second breeder does that, it's their obligation to then make sure they have a free commercial path, whichever way they choose to do so.
Yes, Mark, I don't know if you were with us at the beginning of our discussion, but I had a question and I want to have your answer. I said that I have the feeling with the example of Apple, for example, that if I am a traditional breeder, I do some crossing in the fields, and by chance and by luck, the first year I have a natural mutation, and I find something very interesting. 50 years ago, I may fix the variety and present the variety for some plant breeders' rights without any problem. Today, it seems that somebody, if of course the variety is not in the public domain, the breeder may come to me and say, "Oh, your natural mutation, you obtain it with my variety." So don't you think it's a problem?
So again, if somebody takes an initial variety and improves it through a breeding technique that makes very small genetic changes that result maybe in very large morphological or agronomic changes, the reason they use that initial variety is because there's value there. So that value in the initial variety needs to be recognized. In your case, the apple, the graftability, the yield, the performance, et cetera, there may be one or two things changed, but everything else in the variety is still represented by the initial variety. And again, in our view and in the view of UPOF, that must be recognized. There isn't a problem if you're turning this around and saying one breeder takes an apple variety, maybe a public variety or a non-protected or an old variety, and breeds with it, and maybe unintentionally breeds that to be closer to a current variety with some differences that are improvements. That then would not normally be an EDV because that variety wasn't developed from the initial variety. And that's one of the three criteria for being an EDV. So in my view, the contribution of all breeders through this system is appropriately recognized, and progress and value for farmers and society is still maintained.
Thank you. Emma, you want to add something?
Yeah. It's such a good question, because as soon as we get past what is an EDV and trying to get our heads around defining that, then we come to the practical consideration of what then does that mean for us as breeders of initial varieties or breeders of EDVs? So practically, what do we do then? And I think Chris framed it really well in his presentation, talking about balance. We're looking for a balancing here, a balancing of rights and a balancing of value. And I completely agree with you, Mark. We need to consider that value that is being derived and brought from that initial variety. There is no one species where there is only protected varieties. So people are making a choice to use the protected varieties to create the EDVs. Perhaps we should be considering the concepts from the Nagoya Protocol around informed consent and access and benefit sharing when we are considering EDVs.
Yes, but I would insist. You know, breeders always explain that the genetic progress is incremental. And of course, they always explain also that the advantage of UBOV is the breeder's exemption, because they said when I have a breeding program, I use 70% of what I use is protected varieties of my competitors. So this idea that we are using, of course, the best varieties on the market, even than of the others, it's closely linked to the breeding activity. And my problem is that now we use that to say, oh, all what you are doing is essentially derived. And I may do also the link, and I'm interested to know what you think with the debates with some farmers' organization at the level of a treaty on genetic resources. You know, some organization of farmers like Slavia Campesina, for example, they said to us for a long time that intellectual property rights is not normal, because at the end of the day, we are using the genetic resources which were bred and used by farmers on generation and generation. And so they said to us, oh, your varieties are essentially derived in a way. So you know, how you may do the difference? It's a question for you, or for you.
You know, it's like in India, we have a very typical in the law, you know, PBP, FRA law, the farmer can also register his variety, you know, whether it's a land race or is an extant variety or variety of very common knowledge, or he has been growing from, you know, many years. So that variety he can legally, you know, register. And suppose by developing a hybrid, or, you know, by, you know, as a monoparental, and if some company or some institute or some individual do, you know, EDV from there, we are liable to, you know, to pay the, you know, like what we call for the National Gene Bank Fund to the farmer or to the community or to the tribal, you know, area where they have preserved that variety. So this provision has been given, you know, to give them monetary or, you know, commercial compensatory to the initial variety, you know. So that's,
yeah, but at the opposite, India is a country where breeders are not well protected. So it's why the balance is difficult. Mark, you want to add something?
Yeah, so something to add is indeed when breeders access germplasm, whatever that germplasm is, and in some breeders' case, they primarily use their own in-house gene bank, which is what we as Corteva do. But in other cases, in other crops, there is a wide sharing and access of germplasm. And when someone accesses germplasm from a third party, they need to understand if there are any ABS considerations and if there are any intellectual property considerations. So those are both valid concerns and valid questions, but really unrelated. One of the things I hear is this question about back to breeding methods, so specifically gene editing. So the question is, if gene editing is able to make small changes in a variety, and those small changes have a big impact, and maybe those characteristics develop to have a large value, then what is the downside to that in you know, stimulating innovation? And the answer is, again, you're basing your innovation on first the IV and then the steps that you did as a breeder. So the value is a combination of both of those things. But I would contend something much more exciting. So a small change of a current variety and then another small change and another small change, the incremental changes you're talking about is kind of how breeding has progressed over the last number of decades. And that's great. But wouldn't it be much more exciting if breeding methods were able to actually understand the full genetic diversity available in each species? and then be able to access and use that more full genetic variability or diversity, and be able to use that to make even bigger changes and more dramatic advancements in breeding work. And that's kind of the promise as we see it of gene editing. So it isn't a technology used to develop EDVs and then tie up germplasm somehow, but rather it should be seen as a technology that is able to expand breeding work and expand the access to biodiversity in a much more dramatic fashion going forward. And there likely will be more technologies in the future as well. So that is what we really see as, you know, the potential for this. And again, the concept of EDV is very simple. If a breeder takes one variety from someone else, which is protected, and makes small changes, then there's a dependency between those two varieties, and those two breeders need to talk. If as a breeder, you're able to introduce other traits and other germplasm, other genomes from other varieties, then that's, you know, how you've developed your program. But don't just base your program on someone else.
Is there some question in the room? Please, we have some time. Yes. You have a, Kuna, you have a microphone? It's coming.
My name is Aslam Yusuf. I am from Pakistan. My question might be very childish, but is a breeder allowed to develop an EDV from his own initial variety?
Oh, of course.
Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, I've asked this question in a particular background from my country. The farmers are crazy about new numbers. Every year they ask for a new variety from the breeders. And this essentially derived variety idea or practice will be a very easy approach for most of the breeders to bring new numbers every year.
If it is the same breeder, you know, who has developed initial variety, then he can do some improvement, you know, like particular trait, disease resistant or some new addition, and then he can register as a EDV also. But if some other breeder is, you know, doing EDV, then he has to take permission from initial, you know, breeder before he commercialize. You know, he cannot just simply just say, okay, market. But if same breeder can do it, no. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think it's, you know, a fantastic opportunity for people to consider is breeding and creating EDVs from your own genetic material and from your own protected varieties, because as I said before, it you know, has the opportunity to extend the life of your PVR in a way, because you can make smaller changes, but change something essential and bring about those improvements, you know, perhaps in storage or, you know, harvest and maturity and those sorts of things, which are incredible opportunities. So I know that we often see this as a threat and a problem, but there are a lot of opportunities in this space that I think we could definitely explore more.
You know, when a breeder have his initial variety registered, why he wants to call it EDV? Why not new variety? Because it's own variety. And why is going for EDV? First of all, because there's a better value for if he says it's a new variety, because I have developed a new variety, not dependent to have a dependency on my own things. So one is that if I am a breeder myself, but I think the second question is that the gray area in the sea, when we say, now people say that many the parental lines which people have used for BT cotton, they have the initial non-BT version, they have the BT version, all the parental line they have registered as the EDVs. But the hybrids which they have, it's a new hybrid, because they have registered as a new hybrid. So the parental lines are EDVs because they have changed their parental line, which is not 100% conforming to the original IV, because when they have the back crossing, they have some changes which we have identified. The new variety, which they came out with the same parental lines with BT gene, they have some value addition, they call it, maybe some part of earliness or better balls there. So they find some differences because it's not similar, we say, to the non-BT cotton. So there are, these are some of the areas which PVP authority has challenged it, that, and even one person came with the idea of, hybrid as EDV, which is a segregating population. So they asked PVP authority to register it as a BT version of the hybrid, which is there's a non-BT version, BT as a EDV. But as per the definition, the initial variety should be stable, because then you can use it. But hybrid is not stable. Hybrid is a segregating population. So there are different challenges coming to the authority, that how people are coming with things. But I think if there is a one breeder created EDV of a variety which is protected, but that breeder has not followed it, and after 3 years he came to know that this variety which is released 3 years back is EDV from my variety. Is there any time limit in the law that when you can challenge the breeder of the EDV, which look like EDV, he has not challenged it before, but he find after some time that it looks like that it is EDV of my variety. So what is the status of law in that?
For the PVP FRA, is they given the 3 months time for raising objection?
No. I have not. I have registered my variety as new variety, but the variety which I developed looks like EDV from a breeder who has initial variety which is registered. But he only came to know because when he followed it after 3 years, that it looks like this is EDV of my variety.
Yeah, but in the act it is not defined so clearly about the point what you raised.
I don't know what the other law says.
I ask to Chris and Han, but as far as I know, you may contest any intellectual property rights for long. You are not obliged to contest it 2 months, 3 months. It may be 10 years after it was.
No, but as per the law, there is a time given to put your objections in the act. In our act, there is a fixed time. If you are not objecting to that variety, it's over.
Yeah, I think I might have some thought on this. I don't think it is limited to the PVP per se, but in most countries there is such limit of actions. So that's, for example, in terms of infringement, that is, so in China it's 3 years. It starts from the day that you know, or you should have known that the infringement happens. So it may give some clue on the EDV, that part. So should be some, I wouldn't say there would be a special requirement for that situation, but I believe in most countries there is the general rule for that. Thanks. Sorry.
Yeah, May, you want to say something? Please. Please.
Hello. I think this is a very interesting question. I think that for me, from my understanding, because if I'm the owner of the initial variety, I should be able to just go after this case because the scope of protection is still valid. Yes. Say, for example, the law, for example, under UPOV, right, 20 years. If it's within 20 years, and if this case happen, I should be able to go after this ADV owner, right? But a specific case like Mr. Chris mentioned for New Zealand, that is not retroactive. Does it refer to this one also? Perhaps he can clarify.
Yeah, I think when you look, if there was a law change, that's when it becomes an issue, because it is unreasonable to extend the possibility of EDVs to varieties that were protected under previous law, because at that time it was quite legal to do what they were doing. and therefore to suddenly make it, to change it is unreasonable. So in our case, the initial variety must be protected under the law that provides for EDVs. Apart from that, there is no time limit. If somebody realizes 10 years later that, oh, that's an EDV, then they can talk and begin the conversation with the owner of the initial variety. Because again, it's a breeder action. In our case, it's nothing to do with the authority as such. So that's him. I mean, if there is an element of where the authority has a role, which does occur in some countries, then that situation might be different. But in our case, I think the question of when the initial variety owner of the initial variety takes action is when they choose to do so, whether it's 1 month after learning or 10 years. I don't think it matters.
I think that there are two issues though, because there is always a time limit on when you may object before grant, which is, I think, what we're talking about. But the time limit is not limited, except in the case of, you've had 3 years having known about the infringement. As long as you have the right granted and you're in a valid term, you can still take enforcement action. So you can object to a grant, and there is a limited time on that. And it is the same for trademarks, which I deal with. We have a 3-month opposition period. We must, object before then. But once that is granted, I can still take enforcement action if I believe that my rights have been infringed. So there are the two things. There's the objection to the grant, and then there's an objection based on an infringement, which you believe has happened. So I think there are the two different differences in the time periods there.
Is there any other questions? Yes, please. Oh, 1, 2.
Just a random thought. There are 2 independent bidders. They have accessed some source material independently without any intention. And they're working for a particular product concept for a particular market requirement. So there are chances that, and a breeder, has already filed an application and he has the variety registered. The other bidder, because the source material is not belonging to any one of them, working for the same breeding concept, product concept, market requirements, but add some value to it. Then how the technology is going to, or the method of identification is going to help these disputes.
No? Yeah.
I'm afraid I didn't actually understand the question. Could you clarify that?
Yeah, there is a source material. 2 breeders have independently accessed it. Okay. And both the breeders are working for a product concept as per the market requirement. So it means they'll be working towards a particular genetic improvement. Okay. And first one breeder, he registers the variety, and while as the other breeder not waits, but he's still working on something else, and he brings some disease resistance or additional to what he wanted to do. Then at certain point, this person comes in, oh, this is my variety, and how are you using it?
Yeah,
the
latest like UPO explanatory notes clearly says the one like first breeder, if he registered a variety, and if the second breeder comes with some improvement, minor improvement, something, but the basic material is same. So the initial breeder will get the rights, no? Because
but
legally
the initial breeder, the other breeder has not accessed the material from a breeder.
No, but then, again, it will go to like, okay, you have to prove it, okay, whether it's the same genetic material or, same pedigree system. But if it is, you say some minor improvement, the second breeder has done, and initial first breeder has already registered the variety. So first breeder who has registered a variety, he get the sole owner of, that variety. Yeah. So it will be considered as a EDV, if it's a minor improvement by second breeder.
No. Well, Mike, no.
If I may, because I think I understand the question.
First breeder has already registered his variety, new variety, as a new variety.
Mark.
So let's say there's a source material A, and we have breeder X and breeder Y who are developing parallel towards the same genetic or towards the same phenotypical direction. So number one, both breeder X and Y, once they develop a variety, will be EDVs of variety A as long as variety A is protected. So both those breeders will be an EDV independent from each other, but there's no dependency between those two. The dependency is rather up to the original variety, variety A. Number two, there's a question of protection. And it could be that variety X and variety Y, if they pass the DUS test, both can be seen as distinct from each other and from initial variety A. So they could get protection. But again, the commercialization isn't dependent upon their relationship, but rather the relationship with the source breeder A. I think that was the question.
Thank you. Question there. Yeah. No, because for more, I don't know if it's okay.
I was just wondering what panelists think about the fact that EDVs are sort of not back in the spotlight, as Chris said. They've been on the sort of the periphery for a long time, but have they become sort of put back into the spotlight because of the advent of all these new technologies that are able to now detect them? So obviously new technologies or new breeding technologies like sort of macro-assisted selection and CRISPR and gene editing, etc., have enabled new ways of potentially creating EDVs, but our ability to detect them now, has that sort of put them back more in the spotlight, I guess, in terms in the last decade or so, and potentially these new forms of detection do you think this might be a way of also protecting the industry a little bit from EDVs as well as creating them? Maybe can these new technologies sort of protect the industry, because if, you know, people will be able to detect them earlier. Yeah.
Who wants to answer?
I think, as Chris noted, EDVs have been in the spotlight for quite a while now, perhaps not so much for New Zealand because we didn't have this concept in our legislation, but operating as we do around the world, it's a topic that's been high in the minds of breeders for quite some time. Certainly with the development of new technologies, they are becoming easier to detect. Wouldn't suggest necessarily, again, that they're a problem per se. Most fundamental is about that balancing of the rights.
No regret? If no, I would like to thank all the panelists and all the speakers of this afternoon about the great job. I hope you know a little more about EDV, and some applause for them. Thank you very much. Yes, and Mark also, of course, he's... yes, stay on.
This works?
Okay.
Yes,
of course.
Yeah. Okay,
I just
have
sorry,
the...
Shivendra, you are supposed
no, absolutely,
to do a wrap-up.
I know, and you have done all the job anyway. So I first thank you for taking this session and making, managing the sessions and all the interesting questions. But yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting discussion. So thanks to all the speakers, and I will not name them because I know I'm going to miss some of them. So all the speakers were present in person and online, for very good presentations, sharing the recent developments, historical background on EDV, recent developments in the UPOW, And we have a very good mix of presentation from UPOW, from the PVP office, from the private sector, both seed and horticulture sector, from the research. So thanks to all. While the concept and practical considerations are mature probably in this part of the world, but when we talk about APSA or Asian Seed Congress, there are many countries who are still learning the concept and trying to evolve and hopefully try to modify their law to have the concept and implications of EDV into their PVP laws. We did have some discussion on EDV in 2019 in Kuala Lumpur during the Asian Seed Congress, but not to this detailed extent. So again, thanks so much. I thank all the speakers again, and I believe we have a photo session. So Kuala, Dr. Arvind, please.
The most important part of
Most important part, we have to document that you were there, right? Okay, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Keep on making EDVs of that. Smart way of doing it.
Pleasure, Jay.
Merci beaucoup.